Exiled at 13, she built a wicker tunnel in Dakota territory. An old homesteader saw her work and shook his head. "That brush pile won't last a week," he said. "You'll freeze to death playing Indian girl, and nobody will find your body until spring." She had no money, no family, no cabin, just willow branches and a technique she'd learned from a woman everyone said was a savage. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped to 36 below zero. But 5 months earlier, Clara Engström had never bent a willow sapling in her life. She arrived at the creek bottom on November 4th, 1887, dragging her dead mother's trunk through frozen mud. 13 years old, $17 in her pocket, nothing else in the world that belonged to her. The Engström homestead, her father's claim before the threshing machine took his arm and the infection took the rest of him, sat at the junction of Willow Creek and the open prairie. 2 years of abandonment had melted the sod walls back into the earth. The dugout foundation was a shallow depression filled with brown water. The root cellar had collapsed. The single cottonwood tree her father had planted still stood, bare branches rattling in the wind like bones. Clara set down the trunk and studied what remained of her inheritance. Nothing. She had inherited nothing except 160 acres of grass, a legal claim that would expire in March if she didn't build a permanent structure, and a stepfather who had made clear she was no longer welcome in his house. Her mother had died of cholera in June. 4 months later, Jonas Lindqvist had remarried. His new wife, Marta, had looked at Clara across the breakfast table and spoken to Jonas as if Clara weren't there. "I'm not feeding another woman's child through winter. She's old enough to work. Send her to town." Jonas had given Clara her mother's trunk, $17, and directions to the road. He did not say goodbye. His 3 sons watched from the barn door as she walked away. None of them waved. The town of Milford offered 3 options for a 13-year-old girl with no family: marriage to whoever would have her, domestic service in a household that would work her 18 hours a day for room and board, or the county poorhouse where children slept 4 to a bed and half of them died before spring. Clara had chosen a 4th option. She would claim her father's land. The land office clerk had laughed when she'd filed the paperwork. A girl homesteader? Alone? He'd stamped her papers anyway. The law didn't prohibit it, and the filing fee was the same regardless of who paid it. "You've got until March 15th to prove up. That means a permanent dwelling and evidence of habitation. Good luck finding a husband before then." Now she stood in the creek bottom, watching the afternoon light fade, and understood for the first time what the clerk's laughter meant. A permanent dwelling. She had no lumber, no nails, no horse to haul logs, no money to buy materials, no neighbors willing to help a girl everyone expected to fail. The wind cut through her wool coat, temperature dropping, first hard freeze coming within weeks. She was going to die here. She understood that with sudden clarity. The question was whether she would die trying or die waiting. The horse appeared on the 3rd day. Clara was attempting to cut sod blocks with a broken spade she'd found in the collapsed root cellar. Her hands were already blistered from the 1st day, bleeding from the 2nd. The frozen ground barely yielded to the blade. Each block she managed to cut weighed 40 pounds and crumbled when she tried to stack it. She had completed exactly 6 blocks. A proper sod house required 3,000. The rider came from the northeast, following the creek. A man in his 50s, gray beard, heavy coat, sitting his horse with the ease of someone who had spent decades in the saddle. He stopped 30 feet away and watched her work for several minutes without speaking. Clara kept cutting. She did not look up. She had learned that looking up invited conversation, and conversation invited advice. and advice from men usually meant being told what she already knew, that she was failing. "You're Eric Engström's girl," the man said. "Not a question." "I'm Clara Engström." She drove the spade into the earth. The impact jarred her bleeding palms. "This is my land." "Your father's land. Your father's been dead 2 years." "My land now. I filed the claim." The man dismounted. He walked to her sod pile and nudged one of the blocks with his boot. It crumbled into frozen dirt. He studied her hands, the blood seeping through the rag she'd wrapped around her right palm, the blisters splitting on her left. "I'm Josiah Hendricks. Farm 3 miles northeast." He pointed. "Your father and I used to share equipment before." Clara kept cutting. Another block. This one cracked down the middle as she lifted it. "You're trying to build a soddy," Hendricks said. "I'm building a dwelling. The claim requires a permanent structure. A soddy needs 3,000 blocks minimum. Cut right, stacked right, with a proper roof. That's 2 men and a team of horses working 3 weeks. You've got no men, no horses, and winter's coming in 3 weeks. Less, maybe." Clara straightened. Her back ached. Her hands ached. Everything ached. "What would you suggest, Mr. Hendricks?" "A log cabin's faster if you got timber, but you'd need to haul logs from the breaks, 10 miles minimum. That's a team and a wagon and a man who knows how to notch corners. You've got none of those either." "Then what?" Hendricks looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were the color of creek ice, pale and hard. "Miss Engström, I buried my first wife and my infant son in the winter of '81. That was a hard winter. This one's shaping up harder. I've been on this prairie long enough to know what kills people. It kills them fast and it kills them slow, but it kills them either way. The fast way is freezing to death in a storm. The slow way is starving to death because you spent all your energy on something that was never going to work." He mounted his horse. "You've got $17, a broken spade, and 3 weeks. You can't build a cabin. You can't build a soddy. You need 8 cords of firewood to survive winter even if you had a cabin, and you can't cut 8 cords alone before the ground freezes. The math doesn't work. It never works for people like you, women alone, children alone, anyone without resources. So I should give up." Hendricks gathered his reins. "I'm saying you should think about what happens when you fail. The county poorhouse is bad, but it's warmer than a grave. A domestic position is hard labor, but it's labor you survive. This," he gestured at her pitiful sod pile, "this is just a slower way of dying. My father built a cabin here by himself. Your father had a horse and a plow and 2 years' wages saved up. You've got a trunk full of your dead mother's dresses and less money than it costs to buy a wood stove." Hendricks turned his horse toward home. "I'll tell the county where to find your body. At least your father's buried here already. They can put you next to him." He rode away without looking back. Clara watched him until he disappeared over the ridge. Then she looked at her bleeding hands, her crumbling sod pile, the skeletal cottonwood tree against the gray sky. The math doesn't work. She knew he was right. She had known it since the moment she'd seen the collapsed dugout. She was going to die out here because she had nowhere else to go and nothing else to try. She sat down on her mother's trunk and cried until she couldn't breathe. Then she wiped her face, wrapped fresh rags around her bleeding hands, and picked up the spade. She had 3 weeks. She would spend them trying. The woman found her 4 days later. Clara had abandoned the sod blocks. Instead, she was stripping bark from a fallen cottonwood, thinking vaguely about building some kind of lean-to against the creek bank. It would not be enough. She knew it would not be enough, but it was something to do while she waited to die. The woman came from the south, walking along the creek bed where the willow thickets were thickest. She was Dakota. Clara knew this from the beadwork on her dress and the way she carried herself, straight-backed and deliberate. Old, maybe 50 or more, though her face was hard to read. She stopped at the edge of the willows and watched Clara work. Clara stopped stripping bark. Her heart pounded. The newspapers were full of stories about Indian attacks. The Spirit Lake massacre had happened 30 years ago. Just 50 miles from here, the same Wapakute band had killed nearly 40 settlers and taken captives. Clara's mother had told her those stories as warnings. Don't wander, don't trust, don't forget what they're capable of. The woman didn't move. She just watched. I don't have anything worth stealing, Clara said. Her voice shook. The woman's expression didn't change. After a moment, she walked forward, moving past Clara to the creek bank, where she knelt and began gathering willow branches that Clara had discarded. Those are too thin to build with, Clara said. The woman ignored her. She selected branches with a care that confused Clara, testing their flexibility, bending them in her hands, setting aside the ones that cracked. When she had gathered perhaps 20, she walked to a flat space near the cottonwood tree and began driving them into the ground. Clara watched, uncomprehending, as the woman created a circle of willow stakes perhaps 8 feet across. The stakes were spaced about a foot apart, driven deep enough to stand upright. Then the woman bent one stake across the circle to meet its opposite, overlapping them and binding them together with stripped bark. She did the same with the next pair and the next. A dome began to take shape. A skeleton of bent willow interlocked at the top, creating an arched framework that looked like an enormous overturned basket. What is that? Clara asked. The woman glanced at her. Warm, she said. Her English was accented but clear. Clara stepped closer. The framework was perhaps 6 feet tall at the center, large enough to sit or lie down inside. The willow stakes flexed when she touched them, but didn't break. The structure seemed impossibly fragile, just thin branches bent into curves. But when Clara pushed against it, the whole dome moved as a single unit, absorbing the pressure and springing back. This won't keep out the cold, Clara said. The woman pulled a bundle from her pack, woven mats made of cattail leaves, rolled tight. She began laying them over the framework, overlapping them like shingles on a roof, starting at the bottom and working up. As she worked, she spoke, short sentences, sometimes single words. Clara understood fragments. The mats trapped air. The layers shed water. The dome shape let wind slide over instead of pushing through. The ground underneath would hold warmth. A small fire inside would heat the whole space. I've seen cabins, Clara said. Cabins with stoves. They're still cold. The woman finished the covering, leaving a small gap at the apex for smoke. Then she gestured for Clara to enter. Clara crawled through the low entrance. Inside, the wind disappeared. The temperature was the same as outside. The mats couldn't generate heat, but the stillness made it feel warmer. No draft, no cutting edge, just air that stayed in one place. In winter, the woman said from outside, snow comes, snow covers. She patted the dome. Warm inside, very warm. Snow will crush it. The woman shook her head. Snow helps. I show you. Her name was Winona. She had been living alone in the creek bottoms for 7 years, since her husband died and her children were taken to the reservation school. She had nowhere to go that she wanted to be, so she stayed in the places she knew, moving between camps, invisible to the settlers who had claimed her people's land. She let Clara stay with her for 3 months. Clara remembered those months as a kind of fever dream later. Days spent learning to select willows, thickness, flexibility, the green wood that bent without breaking. Nights inside the dome shelter while November storms howled outside and the interior stayed warm enough to sleep without shivering. Winona showing her how to weave bark strips into cordage, how to layer grass between mats for insulation, how to read weather in the way birds flew and clouds formed. When Clara finally left in late October, walking north toward her father's claim, Winona had said only one thing: build long, not round, long like a path, the snow will make a tunnel. Clara hadn't understood. She'd nodded anyway. Now, standing in the willow thicket along her father's creek, she understood. Not a dome. A tunnel. An arched passage from the creek bank up to the high ground where she could build a proper cabin someday, if she survived long enough. 50 feet of bent willow covered in woven mats, sealed with bark, buried in snow. The settlers would call it a brush pile. Reverend Ashworth in Milford had already called Winona a savage, and her ways heathen work that no Christian should imitate. Josiah Hendricks had looked at Clara's attempts at construction and seen a dead girl who hadn't stopped moving yet. But Winona's dome had been warm when the wind outside stripped heat from everything it touched. Winona was still alive after 7 years alone in the creek bottoms. The settlers' cabins leaked heat through every crack and gap and used 8 cords of wood a winter to stay above freezing. Clara didn't have 8 cords of wood. She didn't have a cabin. She didn't have time to build one. She had willows. She had Winona's teaching. She had 3 weeks before the ground froze solid. She picked up her axe and walked into the thicket. Martha Hendricks arrived on November 15th, riding side saddle with a burlap sack tied behind her. Clara had completed 12 arch sections of the tunnel framework, willow ribs marching along the creek bank like the skeleton of some enormous serpent. Martha was 41 years old, lean and weathered, with hands that looked like they had never stopped working. She dismounted and studied Clara's construction without speaking for a long moment. Josiah said you were building something strange out here. She untied the burlap sack. I brought cornmeal and salt pork. Call it a loan. Thank you. Clara kept working, bending another willow into position. Her hands had developed calluses over the blisters now. She could work for 6 hours before the pain became unbearable. What is that? Martha gestured at the framework. A shelter. That's not a shelter. That's... Martha searched for words. That's what the Indians build, wickiups or whatever they call them. Wigwams in some places. Winona called it a teepee, but it wasn't. It was something else. I don't know the right word. Winona. Martha's face tightened. You've been with the Indians? One woman. She helped me. She taught me. Martha walked along the framework, touching the bent willows. This is 40 feet long already. You're not building a shelter. You're building a tunnel. Yes. Why? Clara drove another stake into the ground, measuring the spacing by eye, 1 foot between stakes, just as Winona had shown her. Because I can't build a cabin alone. I can't build a soddy alone. I can build this alone. And if the snow covers it the way Winona said, the snow will keep the inside warm. Snow. Martha laughed, a harsh sound, not amused. Snow will crush this flat. These are willow branches. Girl, they're not roof beams. They flex. They don't snap. In a storm? With 2 feet of wet snow piled on top? Clara bent the stake across to meet its partner, overlapped them, and began wrapping the joint with stripped bark. The dome Winona built survived November storms. The frame moved with the wind instead of fighting it. The snow packed on top, and the dome underneath held the weight because the force spread across the whole curve. An arch? Martha's tone shifted, still skeptical, but something else underneath. Like a bridge. Like a bridge. The weight pushes down, but the curve pushes out. As long as both sides are planted solid, the middle can hold more than you'd think. Martha was quiet for a moment. Where did you learn that? The Indian woman teach you engineering? She showed me what worked. I figured out why later. Clara finished the lashing and moved to the next stake. It's the same reason eggs don't break when you squeeze them end to end. The shape is stronger than the material. And the cold? You'll have no stove, no fire bigger than a candle, or you'll burn down your brush pile. How do you expect to survive 40 below in a wicker basket? Body heat and the snow. The snow. Snow is made of air, 90% air. Air doesn't conduct heat. A foot of snow insulates like a foot of wool. Winona's dome got warmer after the first snowfall, not colder. The snow sealed the cracks and trapped the heat inside. Martha stared at her. A 13-year-old girl explaining thermodynamics to me. That Indian woman taught you all this? She taught me that it worked. The reasons... Clara shrugged. I read my father's books. He had an engineering manual from the railroad company. The principles are the same. Martha mounted her horse. You're either the smartest child I've ever met or the most foolish. I don't know which would be worse. She gathered the reins. If that thing collapses in a storm, you'll be buried alive inside your own foolishness. I've seen what happens to children who die alone on the prairie. I've buried them. Think about that before you trust your life to willow branches and Indian magic. She rode away, following the creek north toward the Hendricks farm. Clara watched her go. Then she turned back to her work. 26 arches to complete the framework. 12 done, 14 to go. 11 days until the ground froze solid. She picked up the next willow and started bending. Reverend Thomas Ashworth arrived on November the 23rd, his black coat stark against the gray prairie sky. By then, the tunnel framework stretched 52 feet along the creek bank, 26 arch sections, each one lashed at 4 points, reinforced with horizontal hoops woven between the ribs. It looked like the skeleton of a whale that had died on land, Clara thought, or a giant's rib cage, stripped of flesh. Ashworth dismounted and walked along the structure, hands clasped behind his back, mouth pressed into a thin line. Clara kept working. She was weaving bark strips into mats now, her fingers cracked and bleeding from the rough edges. Miss Engström. Ashworth's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being listened to. I've heard disturbing reports about your activities here. Clara didn't stop weaving. Reports, Reverend? That you've taken up with the Indians, that you're building heathen structures on land meant for Christian settlement, that you've abandoned the civilized methods of your people for the savage practices of godless wanderers. I'm building a shelter, Reverend, so I don't freeze to death. This is not a shelter. Ashworth gestured at the framework with barely concealed disgust. This is an abomination, a brush pile, the kind of thing animals build. Do you know what the scripture says about those who abandon the ways of righteousness for the customs of the heathen? Clara's hands kept moving, strip over strip, weaving the pattern Winona had taught her. I know what the scripture says about helping widows and orphans. Reverend, I haven't seen much of that help lately. Ashworth's face reddened. You have been offered help. The church would find you honest work. Domestic service. 18 hours a day, no wages, nothing of my own until I'm old enough that no one else wants me. That's not help. That's a different kind of death. And this is better? Living like a savage? Trusting your immortal soul to heathen practices? Clara finally looked up. Her eyes were steady, Ashworth noticed, and something in his expression flickered. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't ashamed. She was looking at him the way his wife looked at him when she knew she was right and he was wrong. My soul is between me and God, Clara said. My body is my problem. I'm solving it the only way I can. Ashworth stepped closer. You don't understand, child. This isn't just about survival. It's about what kind of life you're building. A Christian woman does not live in the manner of savages. A Christian woman does not take instruction from heathens. A Christian woman freezes to death in a cabin her husband built because that's the civilized way to die? Clara's voice rose. My mother was a Christian woman. She died of cholera because our Christian well was dug too close to our Christian outhouse. Is that the righteousness you're preaching? Silence. The wind moved through the willow thicket, rattling the dry branches. Ashworth's jaw worked, but no words came. I'm going to survive this winter, Clara said. I'm going to prove up this claim, and when spring comes, I'm going to build a proper cabin with a proper chimney and a proper door, and you can come pray over it all you want. But right now, this is what I have. Willow branches and bark and whatever I can scavenge before the ground freezes. If that offends God, he's welcome to strike me down. But I don't think he will. She returned to her weaving. Ashworth stood motionless for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice cold. I'll be speaking with the land office. A brush pile is not a permanent dwelling. Your claim will be denied. Speak with whoever you like. I'll still be here in March. You'll be dead in March, or you'll wish you were. He mounted his horse. I will pray for your soul, Miss Engström, but I will not lie to the land office to save a girl who chooses damnation over decency. He rode away toward town. Clara's hand shook as she wove the next strip, not from cold, from anger, from fear. Ashworth could destroy her claim with a word, tell the land office clerk that her structure wasn't a dwelling, that she was living like an Indian, that she was unfit for civilized society. She had 21 days until winter closed in completely. 21 days to finish the mats, seal the structure, stockpile what little food she could afford. And now she had an enemy who wanted her to fail. Her hand steadied. Strip over strip, weaving the pattern. She could not control what Ashworth did. She could only control what she built. December arrived with the first real snow, 4 inches overnight, turning the prairie white and silent. Clara had completed the mat covering 3 days earlier, working until her fingers bled and then working longer. The tunnel was sealed now, bark mats layered shingle style from ground to apex, gaps stuffed with dried grass, both ends fitted with hanging flaps she could push aside to enter. She crawled inside on December 1st and felt the wind disappear. Outside, the temperature was 12 degrees above zero, cold enough to kill an exposed person in hours. Inside the tunnel, wrapped in both blankets Winona had given her, Clara could feel her own body heat filling the space. Her breath fogged in the dim light filtering through the mat walls, but the fog didn't move. No draft, no wind chill, just still air and her own warmth radiating outward. The tunnel was 52 feet long, 6 feet high at the apex, 8 feet wide at the base. She had divided it into sections with hanging mats, a sleeping area at one end, deep in the curve of the creek bank where the ground stayed warmer, a storage area in the middle for her food and tools, a working area near the entrance where she could build small fires for cooking without filling the whole space with smoke. It worked. God help her, it actually worked. But winter hadn't truly arrived yet. 12 above zero was cold, but it wasn't deadly. The real test would come when temperatures dropped below zero, when the wind howled at 40 miles per hour, when the snow piled deep enough to bury a standing man. Hendricks had said she would freeze playing Indian. Martha had said she would be buried alive. Ashworth had said she was choosing damnation. Clara lay in her sleeping area, wrapped in blankets, and listened to the absolute silence inside the tunnel. Outside, the wind was picking up. She could hear it moaning through the willow thicket, rattling the bare branches of the cottonwood tree. Inside, nothing. The mats absorbed the sound. The curved walls deflected the force. The whole structure moved slightly with each gust, flexing like a living thing, but nothing tore, nothing collapsed. "Snow will help," Winona had said. Clara still didn't fully understand. Snow was weight. Snow was cold. How could snow help? She would find out. The winter was just beginning. The first real storm came on December 8th. Clara woke to a roaring sound, wind that seemed to come from every direction at once, slamming against the tunnel walls with a fury she had never experienced. She pushed aside the entrance flap and saw nothing. Not darkness, nothing. A wall of white snow driving horizontally, so thick she couldn't see her own hand when she extended it into the wind. She pulled back inside, heart pounding. The tunnel was shaking. The whole structure swayed with each gust, the willow frame groaning and creaking, the mats straining against their lashings. Clara crawled to the first lashing point and checked it, tight, secure, no sign of loosening. She crawled to the next, and the next. Every joint she had tied, every horizontal hoop she had woven into place, she checked them all while the wind screamed outside and the tunnel shuddered around her. 2 mats on the eastern side, the side facing into the wind, began to tear loose. Clara grabbed her bundle of spare bark strips and crawled to the damage, fighting to hold the mats in place with one hand while she lashed them tighter with the other. Her fingers went numb within minutes. She couldn't feel the bark strips, couldn't tell if she was tying knots or just tangling cord. She tied anyway, pulling tight, working by feel when her fingers stopped reporting. When she finished, she crawled back to her sleeping area and wrapped her hands in blankets until the pain of returning circulation made her gasp. The storm lasted 2 days. On the morning of December 10th, Clara pushed aside the entrance flap and found herself looking at a wall of snow. The drift had packed against the entrance, sealing it completely. She spent an hour digging through with numb hands, tunneling toward the dim gray light she could see filtering through the snowpack. When she finally broke through, she stood in a transformed world. The tunnel was buried, not just covered, buried. Snow had drifted over the entire structure, packing against the curved walls, filling every hollow, creating a smooth white mound that rose from the creek bank like the back of a sleeping animal. Only the apex was visible, a thin line of bark matting poking through 3 feet of accumulated snow. Clara stared at the buried tunnel. Then she crawled back inside. It was warm, not just warmer than outside, warm. The temperature inside the tunnel had risen during the storm, not fallen. Her breath still fogged, but less than before. The walls felt different, solid, insulated, protected by a 3-foot layer of packed snow that blocked the wind and trapped her body heat. Snow will help. She understood now. The snow wasn't crushing the tunnel. The arched framework distributed the weight, just as she told Martha. And the snow wasn't making the tunnel colder. It was insulating it, sealing the cracks, creating a barrier between the frigid outside air and the space where Clara huddled with her blankets. The storm that should have killed her had made her shelter stronger. She laughed. The sound echoed strangely in the snow-packed tunnel, muffled and close. She laughed until she cried, and then she cried until she was empty, and then she sat in the dim gray light and calculated what she had left. Food. 12 days of cornmeal if she ate only once a day. A few strips of salt pork, bark she could boil into broth. Firewood. A small pile of fallen cottonwood branches, enough for cooking but not for heating. Money. $4.37. Not enough to resupply from town, even if she could reach town through the drifts. Time, 3.5 months until spring. The math still didn't work. She was going to run out of food long before the snow melted. He was going to starve in a warm tunnel, which was better than freezing in a cold grave, but not by much. One problem at a time. She was alive. The tunnel was holding. The snow was helping. She would deal with the food problem tomorrow. The help came on December 15th from an unexpected direction. Clara was gathering bark from the cottonwood tree, stripping the inner layer that could be boiled into something approaching nutrition, when she saw him. A man, walking along the creek from the south, old, maybe 60 or more, moving with the deliberate pace of someone who had been walking a very long time. He was Dakota. She knew this from his clothing, his bearing, the way he studied the landscape as he walked. He stopped at the edge of the willow thicket and looked at the snow-buried tunnel for a long time without speaking. Clara waited. Her hands kept stripping bark. The man walked to the tunnel entrance and knelt, examining the structure, the curve of the buried arch, the way the snow had packed against the mats, the ventilation gap she had left at the apex. He traced his fingers along the willow frame where it emerged from the snowpack. Then he looked at Clara. "Winona taught you," he said. His English was clear, unaccented, the English of someone who had been forced to learn it in a government school. "Yes. She taught you well." He stood. "But your mats are too thin, not enough layers. When the deep cold comes, 40 below, 50 below, the heat will bleed through." Clara felt her stomach drop. "I don't have more materials. The cattails are frozen into the creek." The man nodded. He was studying her now, her gaunt face, her cracked hands, the way she stood as if standing required effort. "You're starving." "I'm managing." "You're starving, and you won't last until spring, but you might last until February if you do this." He knelt and began demonstrating. Taking the bark strips Clara had gathered, layering them with dried grass she had collected for bedding, packing the layers tight with stones to compress the air pockets. More layers, smaller air spaces. Insulation works by trapping air. The more layers, the more traps. The snow on top is good, but the snow came by accident. This you do on purpose. He worked with her for 3 hours. They didn't speak much. He showed. She followed. And by the end of the afternoon, the eastern wall of the tunnel had an additional layer of bark and grass matting that added perhaps 2 inches of insulation. "The rest you do yourself," the man said. "Same pattern. Cover the hole inside before the deep cold comes." "I don't know your name." He paused at the edge of the willows, looking back. "Names are for people who need to find you. No one needs to find me." He studied the tunnel one more time. "The snow will help, but only if the frame holds. Check your lashings every day. The weight builds. If a joint fails, the whole section will collapse." "How do you know so much about this?" The man smiled, a brief, sad expression. "My grandmother built these when I was a boy, before the soldiers came, before the reservations." He turned south. "Winona knew the old ways. She taught you. Now you teach the others when you survive. This knowledge should not die with us." He walked away along the creek. Clara watched until he disappeared into the gray distance. "Check the lashings. Add more layers. The snow will help, but only if the frame holds." She crawled back into the tunnel and started working. By January 1st, Clara had added 3 layers of insulation to the interior walls. She had also eaten her last cornmeal 4 days earlier and was surviving on bark broth and the occasional rabbit she managed to snare using techniques Winona had shown her. Her weight had dropped until her hip bones jutted sharp against her dress. Her hair was fallen out in clumps. When she tried to stand too quickly, black spots swam across her vision, and she had to grab the tunnel wall to keep from falling. But she was alive. The tunnel had survived 2 more storms. The snowpack was now 4 feet deep over the structure, creating an insulated shell that maintained an interior temperature near freezing, even when the exterior dropped to 20 below. Clara's body heat, diminished as it was from starvation, was enough to keep the air inside warm enough to survive. January 11th dawned warm. Clara crawled out of the tunnel entrance. She had to dig through fresh snow every few days to keep it clear, and felt warmth on her face. Real warmth. The temperature was above freezing for the first time in weeks. Water dripped from the exposed willow branches. The snow on the tunnel's apex was softening, losing its hard-packed edge. She stood in the thin winter sunlight and felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Maybe the worst was over. Maybe the deep cold Hendricks had warned about, 40 below, 50 below, the killing cold that stopped hearts and froze lungs, maybe it wasn't coming this year. Maybe she would make it to spring on bark broth and stubbornness. She walked to the creek, broke through the thin ice, and washed her face with water that felt almost warm compared to what she was used to. She straightened her dress, tried to comb her thinning hair with her fingers, and thought about walking to the Hendricks farm. Maybe Martha would trade food for work. Maybe Josiah's judgment had softened over the winter. Maybe. The sky changed. Clara looked up and saw the cloud bank rolling in from the northwest, a wall of black that seemed to eat the horizon as she watched. The temperature had been climbing all morning, but now she felt the wind shift, felt the first edge of cold knife through the warm air. She had seen this before, during the December storm, the warmth before the cold, the exhale before the killing breath. She ran for the tunnel. The wind hit before she reached the entrance, a blast of Arctic air that dropped the temperature 30 degrees in seconds. Snow began falling, not flakes, but ice crystals, horizontal, driving into her face like sand. She couldn't see. She couldn't breathe. The wind filled her mouth and nose with particles so fine they felt like drowning. She found the tunnel entrance by feel, pulled herself inside, let the hanging mat fall closed behind her. And then the real storm began. The sound was unlike anything Clara had experienced. Not wind. Wind had direction, came from somewhere, went somewhere else. This was a roar that surrounded the tunnel completely, pressing in from every side, as if the air itself had turned hostile. The mat walls shuddered. The willow frame groaned. Snow began forcing through gaps she hadn't known existed, fine as dust, accumulating in thin lines along the interior walls. Clara crawled to her sleeping area and wrapped both blankets around herself. The temperature inside the tunnel was dropping fast. She could feel it in the way her breath fogged thicker, the way the cold seeped through the blankets into her bones. Outside, the roaring grew louder. She had survived storms before. The December storm had been bad. 2 days of wind and snow, mats tearing loose, frantic repairs with numb fingers. But even during the worst of it, she had been able to see. She had been able to hear individual gusts, track their direction, anticipate where the stress would hit next. This was different. This was a wall of sound and fury that obliterated everything else. She couldn't hear the willow frame creaking anymore. The roar swallowed all other sounds. She couldn't see the mat wall shuddering. The dim light filtering through the snowpack had gone completely dark. She was blind and deaf inside her own shelter, and the only sensation left was cold. The first hour passed in darkness. Clara pressed herself against the curved wall of the sleeping area, where the ground retained some warmth from weeks of her body heat. She tucked her hands into her armpits, drew her knees to her chest, made herself as small as possible. The blankets helped, but she could feel the cold winning seeping through the wool, stealing heat from her skin, working its way toward her core. She tried to calculate. The December storm had dropped temperatures to 20 below zero. The tunnel had maintained an interior temperature near freezing, cold, but survivable. If this storm was worse, 30 below, 40 below. The math changed. The snow insulation helped, but insulation only slowed heat transfer. It didn't stop it. Eventually, the cold outside would equal the cold inside. How long? She didn't know. She couldn't know. She could only wait and feel the temperature drop and hope the frame held and the snow packed tight and her body generated enough heat to matter. Her stomach cramped. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. The last rabbit snare had been empty, and she'd been saving her final handful of dried bark for an emergency. This qualified. She fumbled in the darkness for her supply cache, found the bark by touch, and chewed it slowly. It tasted like dirt and desperation. It wouldn't give her much energy, but it was something in her stomach, something for her body to work with. The roaring continued. The cold deepened. Clara chewed bark and waited to die. She didn't know when she fell asleep. She didn't know how long she slept. She woke to a different kind of darkness, not the absolute black of the storm's peak, but a dim gray that meant light was filtering through from somewhere. The roaring had stopped. Clara lay still, afraid to move, afraid that movement would shatter whatever fragile equilibrium had kept her alive. She could feel her body. That was good. That meant she wasn't frozen. Her fingers ached when she flexed them. Her toes sent sharp protests when she wiggled them inside her boots. Pain meant circulation. Pain meant life. She sat up slowly. The tunnel was intact. She could see the curved walls, the hanging mats that divided the sections, the snow that had forced through the gaps and now lay in thin drifts along the floor. The willow frame was still there, still holding, though she could see places where the ribs had bowed inward under the weight of accumulated snow. The entrance. She needed to check the entrance. Clara crawled toward the front of the tunnel, her blankets dragging behind her. The hanging mat that served as a door was still in place, but when she pushed it aside, she saw nothing but white. Solid white. A wall of packed snow where the entrance should be. She was buried. The storm had sealed her inside. The snow that had been insulating her was now imprisoning her. She pushed against the white wall with her palm, solid, compacted, dense as earth. This wasn't the fluffy snow of a normal storm. This was snow that had been driven by 60-mile-per-hour winds, packed layer upon layer until it became something closer to ice than powder. Clara felt panic rising in her chest. She couldn't breathe. She forced herself to stop. Breathe. Think. The tunnel was still intact. She had air. The ventilation gap at the apex must still be clear, or she would have suffocated in her sleep. She wasn't injured. She wasn't frozen. She was trapped, but she was alive. One problem at a time. The digging took 3 hours. Clara used her hands at first. No tools. Nothing that could cut through compacted snow. She scraped and clawed and pushed, working her fingers into the white wall, pulling out handfuls of snow that she piled behind her in the tunnel. Her hands went numb within minutes. She kept digging. The numbness turned to pain. She kept digging. The pain faded to a dull throb that meant she was doing damage, real damage, frostbite setting in. She wrapped her hands in strips torn from her spare petticoat, kept digging. The snow was 3 feet deep at the entrance, 3 feet of compacted ice snow that had to be removed handful by handful, pile by pile, before she could break through to the outside. The tunnel behind her filled with snow debris. She crawled over it, around it, packing it down with her knees to make room for more. When she finally broke through, the cold hit her like a physical blow. The temperature outside was negative 12 degrees, she learned this later, from Hendricks, who had a thermometer on his porch. But in that moment, pushing her face through the holes she had clawed in the snow wall, all she knew was that the cold was brutal, absolute. The kind of cold that stopped breath and froze tears before they could fall. She pulled back inside and let the snow wall close around the hole. She needed a smaller opening, a ventilation hole, not an exit, just enough to bring fresh air in without letting all her heat out. She used a willow stick to poke a hole 2 inches across at the top of the entrance, where the packed snow was thinnest. Cold air rushed in, sharp, clean, painful, in her lungs. But she could breathe. The carbon dioxide that had been building while she slept began to clear. Her head, which had been pounding without her realizing it, started to ease. She crawled back to the sleeping area and wrapped herself in blankets and waited for the world to end. The storm had broken, but the cold had not. Clara lay in her sleeping area and listened to the silence. No wind now, just the absolute stillness of deep cold, the kind of cold that freezes sound itself. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear her own breath, shallow and careful, each exhale a small cloud that hung in the air before slowly dissipating. She was warmer than she should be. That was the strange thing. The temperature outside was murderous. She could feel it in the cold radiating through the tunnel walls, in the way the snowpack had hardened into something like concrete. But inside her blankets, in the still air of the tunnel's core, she wasn't freezing. Body heat. The Dakota man had been right. The extra insulation layers she had added were working. Her own body, starving, weakened, barely functional, was still generating heat. Maybe 100 watts if she remembered her father's engineering manual correctly. 100 watts in a sealed space, with 4 feet of snow blocking the wind and trapping whatever warmth she produced. It wasn't comfortable. Her toes throbbed with cold. Her fingers ached. The tip of her nose felt like it might fall off. But she was alive. And she was going to stay alive, because the tunnel was holding, and the snow was helping, and the cold couldn't reach her core. She pulled the blankets tighter and thought about Winona. Winona had built shelters like this for 7 years, surviving winters alone in the creek bottoms, while settlers froze in their cabins 3 miles away. The settlers had called her a savage. They had called her ways primitive, heathen, uncivilized. They had looked at her willow domes and bark mats and seen something less than human. They were wrong. Winona had understood something the settlers refused to learn, that the land itself could protect you if you stopped fighting it. That snow wasn't just a threat, but a resource. That flexibility survived where rigidity broke. Clara had learned that lesson. She was living it now, wrapped in blankets inside a willow tunnel while the worst blizzard in 30 years raged outside. She was alive because an Indian woman had taken pity on a starving white girl and shared knowledge that had been old when the first Europeans arrived. When she got out of this, if she got out of this, she would teach others. That was what the Dakota man had said. This knowledge should not die with us. Clara would make sure it didn't. But first she had to survive the night. The sound started around midnight. Clara was dozing, not sleeping, not truly, but drifting in the gray space between consciousness and unconsciousness, where the cold couldn't reach her thoughts. A thud against the tunnel wall brought her fully awake. Then another. Then a scraping sound, like something dragging along the packed snow. She held her breath. The sounds continued, erratic, desperate, moving along the eastern wall of the tunnel toward the entrance. Something was out there, something alive, trying to find shelter from the cold that Clara knew was killing everything exposed to it. Human or animal? She couldn't tell. The sounds were muffled by 4 feet of snow, distorted by the wind that had picked up again. But they were real. Something was dying 20 feet from where she lay, separated from safety by a wall of snow it couldn't penetrate. Clara should help. She knew she should help. If it was a person, a neighbor, a traveler, someone caught in the storm, she should dig through the entrance and pull them inside. A person could survive in the tunnel, Two bodies would generate more heat than one, but if she opened the entrance, she would let the cold in. The fragile equilibrium that was keeping her alive would shatter. The temperature inside would drop to match the temperature outside, and at negative 30 or 40 degrees, whatever it was now, she wouldn't survive long enough to close the entrance again. She had no food to share. She had no extra blankets. She had nothing to offer except a space in a tunnel that might not be warm enough for one person, let alone two. The sounds continued for perhaps an hour, scraping, thumping. Once, something that might have been a voice, a moan, a cry, something human and desperate and dying. Clara pressed her hands over her ears and squeezed her eyes shut and told herself there was nothing she could do. The sounds stopped some time before dawn. She would not know until morning what had made them. She would not know if her choice had been right or wrong, necessary or monstrous. She knew only that she was alive, and something outside was not, and the tunnel had held while the cold took everything it could reach. Dawn came gray and silent. Clara dug through the entrance again. The hole she had made the day before had drifted closed and emerged into a world she didn't recognize. The landscape had been erased. Every familiar landmark was buried under snow so deep it had reshaped the terrain itself. The willow thicket was gone, just scattered branches poking through white drifts. The creek was invisible. The cottonwood tree was a white pillar, its branches weighted with ice. The tunnel had disappeared entirely. From outside, it was just another snow mound, a long ridge running along the creek bank, white on white, indistinguishable from the drifts surrounding it. If Clara hadn't known exactly where to dig, she would never have found the entrance. She walked 30 feet to the east, her legs sinking to mid-thigh with each step. There, drifted against what remained of a willow thicket, she found the source of the sounds. A cow, one of the Hendricks' cattle, by the brand on its frozen flank. It had wandered in the storm, blind and desperate, and found its way to the creek bottom where some instinct told it shelter might exist. It had scraped against the tunnel wall, trying to reach the warmth it could somehow sense inside. It had died there, less than 3 feet from the mats that would have blocked the wind. Clara stared at the frozen animal for a long time. Then she turned and looked at her tunnel, the snow-buried ridge that had saved her life. The willow frame hadn't collapsed. The snow had packed around it, over it, through the gaps in the mats, creating a shell of ice and compacted snow that was stronger than any wall she could have built from logs. The entrance was drifted shut, the apex barely visible, the whole structure buried like something ancient and waiting. She had survived. 235 people across the northern plains had not. Josiah Hendricks arrived on January 14th, 2 days after the storm broke. Clara was outside the tunnel, trying to dig a path to the creek so she could get water. Her hands were wrapped in bloody rags. The frostbite from her escape digging had blistered and split, and she was working slowly, conserving what little energy remained. She heard the horse before she saw it, the crunch of hooves through crusted snow. Hendricks pulled up at the edge of the buried willow thicket. He stared at the snow mound that had been Clara's tunnel. He stared at Clara, standing waist-deep in a drift, gaunt and pale and very clearly alive. "I came to find your body," he said. "I'm sorry to disappoint you." Hendricks dismounted. He walked to the tunnel entrance. Clara had dug it clear that morning and stood looking at the hole in the snow. Then he got down on his hands and knees and crawled inside. Clara waited. When Hendricks emerged, his face had changed. The hard certainty was gone. Something else had replaced it. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of something that looked like respect. "It's warm in there," he said. "Warmer than outside. Warmer than your cabin, I'd guess, during the worst of it." Hendricks shook his head slowly. "My cabin dropped to 10 below on the inside during the peak. We burned every stick of wood we had and couldn't keep it above freezing. Lost 2 chickens in the coop. Lost a calf in the barn. He looked at the snow-covered tunnel again. You sat in a brush pile through 40 below wind chill, and it stayed above freezing inside? The snow helps. It insulates. The arch distributes the weight so it doesn't collapse. The body heat has nowhere to go, so it builds up. Clara's voice was flat. She was too tired for triumph. Winona taught me. The Indian woman everyone called a savage. She survived 7 winters alone in shelters like this. Hendricks was quiet for a long moment. I told you that you'd freeze playing Indian, that you'd be dead by spring. You did? I was wrong. The words seemed to cost him something. I don't say that often. Martha can tell you. I don't admit mistakes. But I was wrong about this. Wrong about you. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a burlap sack. Cornmeal, salt pork, coffee. Martha sent it. She said, he paused. She said she wants you to show her how you built this thing. She wants to build one over the root cellar entrance before the next storm. Clara took the sack. Her hand shook. Hunger, exhaustion, relief, all of it hitting at once. Tell her I'll show her. Tell her I'll show anyone who wants to learn. Hendricks mounted his horse. The land office clerk is coming in March. I'll testify this is a permanent dwelling. Anyone who says otherwise can come look at it themselves. He gathered the reins. You might be the stubbornest person I've ever met, Clara Engström. I'm glad you're not dead. He rode away toward his farm. Clara stood in the snow, holding a bag of food she hadn't expected, watching a man who had told her she was already dead ride home to tell his wife she was alive. Martha Hendricks came the next day. She brought food, more cornmeal, dried apples, a precious jar of honey, and she brought questions. How did you bend the willows without breaking them? How did you calculate the spacing? How did you know the arch would hold the weight? Clara showed her. They crawled through the tunnel together, Clara pointing out the lashing points, the horizontal hoops, the layered insulation the Dakota man had taught her. Martha touched the frozen walls, felt the temperature difference between inside and outside, watched her breath fog in the dim light. It's like a cave, Martha said. A cave made of sticks and snow. It's like an igloo. That's what the Eskimos build in the far north, houses of snow. Same principle. The snow itself becomes the wall. But you didn't build it from snow. You built a frame, and the snow came on its own. That's the trick. You don't have to cut snow blocks. You don't have to pack anything. You build the frame, cover it with mats, and wait for winter. The winter does the rest. Martha sat in the tunnel's center, looking at the curved walls. The December storm buried the Sorensen barn. 4 feet of drift against the east wall. They lost 3 horses inside. The snow blocked the door, and the horses suffocated before they could dig them out. She paused. If they'd built something like this over the door, a tunnel leading out, the snow would have covered the tunnel too, but the tunnel would have stayed open inside. Air could flow. They could have dug out from the inside. Show me. Martha's voice was different now, urgent, practical, the voice of a woman who had seen what winter could do and wanted weapons against it. Show me how to build one, not the whole thing, just a short one, over a doorway, something we can put up before the next storm. Clara showed her. Reverend Ashworth did not come to the tunnel. He sent word through the Hendricks family that he had withdrawn his complaint with the land office. In light of changed circumstances, his message said, without specifying what had changed. Clara understood. Ashworth could not admit he had been wrong without undermining his own authority. He could not visit the tunnel without acknowledging that the heathen work he had condemned had saved a life while 2 Christians in Milford had frozen in their cabins. So he did neither. He withdrew his opposition and pretended the whole thing had never happened. It was not conversion, it was retreat. Clara would take it. The other settlers were more direct. Within 2 weeks of the storm, 4 families had sent representatives to study Clara's tunnel. They came with questions, with skepticism, with the grudging curiosity of people who had survived something terrible and wanted to make sure they never went through it again. Clara showed them all. She drew diagrams in charcoal on bark scraps, the spacing of the willows, the angle of the bends, the pattern of the lashings. She explained the layering technique the Dakota man had taught her. She answered questions about snow loads and ventilation and body heat until her voice gave out. Some of them built shelters. The Sorensens constructed a willow arch passage between their cabin and barn, 20 feet long, 8 feet high, covered with bark mats. When the February storms came, the passage filled with drifted snow on the outside and stayed clear on the inside. Their horses survived. Their children could reach the livestock without crossing open ground in whiteout conditions. The Petersons built a smaller version over their root cellar entrance. The Olsons added a tunnel to their chicken coop. None of them called it a wigwam or a wickiup or anything else that might sound Indian. They called them snow passages or drift tunnels or just the arch thing the Engström girl built. The names didn't matter. The knowledge was spreading. The land office clerk arrived on March 12th, 3 days before Clara's claim would expire. His name was Harold Sutton. He was 34 years old, educated in St. Paul, and he had never seen anything like the structure Clara led him to examine. The snow was melting now. March had brought temperatures above freezing, and the tunnel was emerging from its winter burial like something ancient breaking through ice. Sutton walked around it twice. He measured the length with a surveyor's chain, 52 feet. He measured the width, 8 feet at the base. He crawled inside and sat in the dim interior for several minutes, making notes in a leather-bound book. "Miss Engström," he said when he emerged, "this is highly irregular." "Yes, sir. The regulations specify a permanent dwelling suitable for habitation, 12 by 12 feet minimum with a door and a window. This is 52 by 8 feet with 2 entrances. I've been living in it since November. I'd say that makes it suitable for habitation." Sutton frowned at his notes. The regulations also specify frame, log, or sod construction. This is... He gestured at the willow ribs, the bark mats, the melting snowpack. "I don't know what this is." "It's a willow-frame structure with layered bark and grass insulation, reinforced by natural snow accumulation." Clara's voice was steady. She had prepared for this. Frame construction means a skeletal structure covered with a weatherproof material. That's what this is. The fact that the material is bark instead of boards doesn't change the principle. Hendricks spoke up from behind them. He had ridden over to witness the inspection. "Mr. Sutton, I've homesteaded this territory since '79. I've seen a lot of people die trying to prove up claims. Most of them froze in structures that were up to code, log cabins with doors and windows and stoves, all regulation, all useless when the real cold came." He pointed at the tunnel. "That thing saved her life in the January blizzard. 40 below, 60-mile-an-hour winds, and she sat in there while the rest of us burned our furniture to stay alive. If that's not a permanent dwelling, I don't know what is." Sutton looked at Hendricks, then at Clara, then at the tunnel. He made one more note in his book. "The purpose of the homestead regulations," he said slowly, "is to encourage settlement of the territory by ensuring that claimants are serious about establishing permanent residence. The specific construction requirements exist to ensure that dwellings are safe and habitable." He closed the book. "This structure is clearly habitable. You've proven that by living in it for 4 months. As for safe," he almost smiled, "I'd say surviving a blizzard that killed 200 people qualifies as safe." He signed the papers. Clara Engström's claim was approved. The land was hers. Clara remained on the Willow Creek homestead until 1894. In April of 1888, as soon as the ground thawed, she began building a proper cabin, frame construction, sawn lumber hauled from the railroad depot 20 miles south, a stone chimney, glass windows, everything the regulations originally specified. The willow tunnel stayed standing. Clara maintained it, replaced mats that rotted in the summer humidity, reinforced lashings that loosened over time. She used it as a root cellar, a cool storage space in summer, an emergency shelter when the winter storms came. The February blizzard of 1889 buried it again, and again it held. She taught the technique to 23 people in the first year. Farmers, ranchers, a school teacher from Milford who wanted to build an emergency shelter behind her schoolhouse. Some of them built their own versions. Some of them taught others. By 1890, the Willow Arch snow passage had become common enough along Willow Creek that no one remembered who had introduced it. In 1894, Clara married Anders Lindgren, a Swedish immigrant who had arrived in the territory 2 years earlier. He had seen her tunnel, asked her to teach him, and built one over the entrance to his claim shanty. When he proposed, he told her it was because she was the smartest person he had ever met. She told him it was because he was the only man who had asked to learn from her, instead of telling her what she was doing wrong. They raised 4 children on the homestead. All of them learned to bend willows without breaking them. All of them could build a shelter from scratch if they had to. Clara made sure of that. She died in 1951 at the age of 77, still living on the land she had claimed as a starving orphan girl. Her obituary in the Willow Creek Gazette mentioned her unusual resourcefulness during the blizzard of '88, but did not describe the tunnel. By then, the Willow Arch technique had been absorbed into local knowledge, passed down, and adapted until no one remembered where it came from. Just something people did in the creek bottoms when the storms came. Just the way things had always been. January 12th, 1888, 36 degrees below zero. Wind screaming at 60 miles per hour. Snow so fine it filled your lungs and stopped your heart. Josiah Hendricks had looked at a 13-year-old girl standing in a willow thicket and said, "That brush pile won't last a week. You'll freeze to death playing Indian, girl, and nobody will find your body until spring." He was wrong. The brush pile held. The willow frame bent with the wind instead of breaking. The bark mats caught the snow, and the snow packed tight, and the arch underneath distributed the weight across 52 feet of frozen ground. The temperature outside dropped to 41 below zero. The temperature inside stayed above freezing. A Dakota woman named Winona had built shelters like that for 7 years before she taught a starving white girl the technique. A Lakota man whose name Clara never learned had shown her how to add insulation layers that made the difference between surviving and dying. They gave her knowledge that their people had accumulated over thousands of winters, and she used it to live through the worst night in 30 years. They found her in March, the land office clerk, and the neighbor who had called her a dead woman. They found her alive, standing in the melting snow beside a structure none of them could explain, holding papers that said the land was hers. Clara Engström was 13 years old. She didn't freeze. She didn't die playing Indian. She built a wicker tunnel in the willows along a frozen creek, and when the snow came, it didn't crush her. It kept her warm.